The late Mike Martinek and I met as part of United Fly Tyre's ongoing meetings in the 60s, early 60s. Mike was a very competent fly tyer with a really burning desire to learn more about how the traditional old Maine streamers, inventions of Herbie Welch and Carrie Stevens and those people from that era, how they made their flies, how they designed them. He really enjoyed that classical approach to fly tying. He was fortunate through United Fly Tyers to meet a guy named Austin Hogan, who I knew as well. Austin later became the curator of the American Museum of Fly Fishing, and had several of Carrie Stevens' flies in his possession. Mike and Austin deconstructed some of those flies and then carefully reassembled them to learn how they were put together, lessons that Mike applied to his later work. Austin was a hard taskmaster. If you did something wrong and you put it on your hook, Austin would look at it and say, "That's wrong," and take a razor blade and cut it off. And you start it over. Mike persevered. He learned his craft very well, became very good at it, probably one of the foremost experts in the world in that type of fly design and the construction of those flies. I was much more interested in his wife Belle's coffee and cookies in the kitchen, and I learned a few things, but I was nowhere near the talent that Mike became, and I'm still not. The construction of these kinds of flies utilizes not only placement of feathers and other materials, but it also utilizes the use of adhesives. And you'll see that as we go along. So we're going to start, but we start in an unusual place, because these flies don't start on the hook initially. They start with constructing the wing assemblies that go on either side of the fly. So we're going to tilt the camera down and pick up some feathers here on the base of my vise. And I'll take the hook out of the vise and get it out of our way so that there's no danger of my sticking myself with it, which I'm capable of doing. What I've done here is stripped this saddle hackle so that most of the material on the base is gone. And I've taken an olive saddle hackle, approximately the same length, and then I put the tips together, make sure that they sort of match, and then strip off material to make sure that these two feathers end up being similar length. A little moisture helps hold them that way. But what we're gonna do is create a unit out of these feathers to which we can attach another unit. And to make these stay together, I have some little clamps. I'm going to try to grab those feathers together just like that and leave a little tiny bit of space right at the base where the two stems come together. And you notice that because these stems are different diameters, one wants to slip when the other doesn't. In that case, you flatten them a little bit with your fingernails and you can grip them. Now, placing them together, we want to make sure that they stay where they're positioned. To do that, Mike would use an old adhesive Sillar varnish. I'm not quite as limited by antiquity. I'm going to take a bit of UV varnish and I'm going to put a little bit right there where the two quills come together. This is a lot faster way to make these assemblies rather than waiting for a varnish to dry over a long period of time. It pays to wipe your dubbing needle off carefully each time. And we can just take a few seconds to cook this UV varnish and we're ready to go on. Using the older methods, this would be an hour's wait until the stuff was set hard. Part of the great joy of making these things, or for that matter, salmon flies in the Elizabethan tradition, a long, slow process of assembling pieces. This helps make them faster, but very few people do this kind of stuff because it's sort of heresy, I suppose. And I'm sort of a heretic. So we would then set this assembly aside to dry. Over that, the shoulder of the wing, this part, we'll just set that right there. We take a feather from a silver pheasant body, and whether it's one that looks like that or one that's more finely modeled is inconsequential as long as both feathers are the same, one for each side. We'll look at this in terms of where it has to lay on the wing and strip away all this soft stuff on the bottom until we have it just right, which is strictly subjective. And we set that down for a moment because we're going to place over that a jungle cock nail or feather from the Indian gray jungle fowl, and it's going to rest like that, sort of straight. Judging where that lays, we then strip away all those fibers and use the same technique that we just used to make that wing assembly. Using a clamp, and a little UV varnish. And a little bit of light holds it together. This would be, in the normal procedure, part of that hour of waiting, because this would then be in line to dry as well before you could manipulate it. And of course, we don't want to sit here for an hour watching the video and watching glue dry, it's not really exciting stuff. So we're going to set this aside, and like I did with the feathers, I already have one of those all made and nice and dry. And we're going to take it, out, have a little extra material there that we don't need, and I'm going to take this already previously assembled pair of feathers, and we're going to lay them in position, one over the other. And do the same thing. Again, a tiny bit of varnish. And a bit more light. A little light on the subject here. Old Elizabethan joke. Some people will, particularly if the fly is going to be used as a display in a frame or something of that nature, will actually put little dots of adhesive along the quills at the center of the wing, and do the same with the jungle cock and the silver pheasant, so that it stays absolutely perfect. I generally don't tie too many flies to frame, because I don't think my flies are necessarily that artistic, but they do catch fish. But having done that, we now have an assembly ready to put on one side of a fly. I've made, and if you look carefully you'll see I use the other version of the silver pheasant feather. I've made a pair of these already, and we can then proceed with the rest of the fly. The hooks for these things traditionally were around a number 1 size and about 10x long. It's a long, long hook. And you get it in the vise so that it's not likely to move around a whole lot. And you lay some thread on here. And it's a long process just wrapping the thread on the hook shank. But you have to build a base to build this fly on. These don't have to be touching turns of thread, but they do have to be close enough so that whatever you lay on here is laid on top of thread, and you go just beyond where the point of the hook is below the shank of the hook, and cut off your excess. Like I said, there's a lot of adhesive here. This would be, again, the same slow curing varnish, and here we're going to use just regular head cement. And the reason we did that instead of the UV varnish is that we're not looking for speed here, we're looking for an adhesive, because we're going to take this tiny little golden pheasant crest and we're going to make a tail about 1 inch long from the point where it's tied in. Just a single pretty little fiber, and we're going to wrap it down quite a ways forward so that we have a nice secure anchorage in that wet head cement, which will keep it right in position permanently. This is where we start getting a little fancy. Transitions from one material to another were done in a lot of different ways. One favorite way from the Elizabethan approach to salmon flies was to make a butt of something like ostrich herl, which is exactly what we're going to do here. A nice black, fuzzy, fluffy feather. And we'll take one, and the fluffier it is, the better. So we get one feather out of there, one fiber. These are soft, pretty delicate. Cut it free. And we're going to tie this in right back here where we initiated the tail. Bring our thread a little bit forward, and then we're going to carefully wrap this in touching turns . You might make an occasional extra wrap of thread to hold it in place until you've got enough material in place. So that you make a little bump or butt of ostrich herl. That's tradition, my friends. Now, traditionally, tinsel was metal. And it just so happens I have a substantial collection of French metallic tinsel. And I'm going to tie this in on the bottom.
This is right.
The hook shank. I keep it fairly short so that it stays out of the way. There's some stiffness here that you don't get with mylar, even though Mike did use mylar occasionally.
I see. So you've had this stuff for a while. Very good.
And I'm going to take some blue single strand rayon floss. I'm going to double it. Move my thread forward so that I've encompassed about 1/3 of the hook shank length. Slide that loop down over and back up to the tying thread and lock it in place. You probably noticed if you follow along with what we usually do here I'm using a vise that's quite different from what I normally use, because this one rotates really nicely. And I'm going to wrap this floss using the rotating vise to help keep things smooth. And remove the excess. Now the tinsel gets spaced out over in nice uniform wraps, not too close together, over that color, and then locked down. I always half hitch at each one of these steps, and I always add a tiny bit, and that's a very tiny bit, of head cement. That head cement is going to be right under another butt of black, which I'll use to separate the three colors that I plan to make this body out of. And in fact, to make things easier and quicker for our application, rather than have you watch me do this whole thing, since the next steps are going to be repetitive uses of these three colors, I have one all made. So we'll just plunk that right in there. And there is the completed body with blue, olive, and white. And we'll put our thread back on, which I would not normally have removed it. In many cases, when this kind of a construction is made, white thread is used so that it doesn't affect the color of the floss when it's wet. I've used it because I don't have any black. It serves the original purpose, and I can color it at the end to make the head black with a black Sharpie. Yeah. I've chosen to drop things on the floor, obviously. Polar bear hair to be the underneath part of this fly. But I'm doing it in two colors to give me a bit of contrast. I'm going to take some white hair, natural polar bear, and I'm going to do what I do with deer hair. I'm going to take out all of the short fibers underneath, and I'm going to test my length here. I want this to, the longest fibers, to be approximately as long as the tail. And I'm going to turn the hook upside down to make life easy. Okay. So there are a few fibers out here where the tail is, and the rest. Leaves me that much material to remove. Snip it away. Nice straight edge. Put it in position on the bottom of the hook shank. And carefully tie it down. Add a tiny bit of head cement. And I'm now going to proceed to more polar bear. But this is dyed a sunburst yellow. Very pretty. And I'll find some fibers of adequate length and take a small bunch, smaller than what I used previously, but longer than what I'm going to need as a finished material. Do the same thing, pull these short fibers out of here, get rid of them. And I want this to be about half the length of the white fibers. So I'm going to check it. And somewhere between half and 2/3. Give me that. We'll take the fancy scissors. This does a better job of snipping ends off of things. Cut it right cleanly off. And place this material right on top of that wet head cement. And wrap it down. And I'm maintaining this nice, neat little head as I do that. And again, as was done all the way along the body, every place else, tiny bit of head cement, nice and thin, runs right in, and will eventually harden and lock all that together. Now, we'll just rotate that right back, right side up, and it's starting to look a little more like a finished fly. And we're going to add to it a bit of peacock pearl. We put 3 strands on top. And these 3 strands, rather than being an integral visible part of the fly, are more to keep the wings that are going to be added divided on the sides, and when we're all done placing the wings, we'll add another 3 strands on top. This is more decorative in its use than anything else, and we want it to reach out about to where the tail is. And we'll tie it in place. Make sure it's right on top. A little bit of moisture never hurts. Carefully trim it to length and lock it down. Now, you remember these? We made these a long time ago. And we're going to take one at a time out of their clamps. Place them on the sides. using just 2 or 3 turns. Lock them in place. Opposing each other. Very carefully positioning everything. And 5 or 6 turns to tie them in tightly. These will never look 100% neat when I tie them. When Mike used to tie them, they were perfect. But I'm going to take my nice sharp pointed scissors here and carefully cut away this excess stem material from all of the feathers that we used. All of these extraneous fibers that we don't need. One at a time. Make sure that everything's still more or less in place. Take a few more turns. We'll lock it down. Found a bit of glue that it's kind of gloppy there. And that's removed. Now, we said we were going to add a little more peacock, and so we shall. And whether it's 3 or 4, not very consequential. And again, a little moisture. Try to get them together. Few turns to lock them in place, and then a few more to help shape the head. Oops, that wasn't supposed to slide way down there, so we'll just reposition that. And form a nice, neat thread head. Get rid of any excess fibers. Looks a little little better than it did with the cheek of the fly sliding down, which means, yes, you can save anything that doesn't look right. Some people strive the saddle hackles in this part of the fly smooth, have no soft fibers. I find the softer fibers add to the movement of the fly and add to its effectiveness in the water. When Mike and I were much younger, at a UFT meeting, I actually told him that when he passed on, I was going to tie one of these beautiful freshwater flies to look like a mackerel in his memory. And he said that it wouldn't happen because I'd go first, and I didn't have the talent anyway. Well, he's probably right about the second part. But I didn't go first. So, Mike, here you are. As I begin the finishing touches coloring the head, nice bit of black thread. A curmudgeon, as we call it. You see, Austin Hogan was certainly a curmudgeon. Anybody that had cut all these beautiful pieces of material off a hook certainly had some sort of unique character trait. And nobody could ever say Austin was not unique. But Mike, you took on that characteristic with real gusto. And it's only fair that I have a fly appropriately named for you. It's winter here now, and finding fresh water to toss this fly into to move it around and get the interest of fish would be a nice thing to do, but unfortunately the water is far too hard at the moment to be able to do anything like that. So I tied a few more of these. I swam this one in Barnstable Harbor just to see how it looked in the water. And I tied a smaller version, which extends way past any hook shank, the hook ending here, on a 1/0 saltwater hook. So yes, I can use this in saltwater to catch a striper in your name. For those of you who never met Mike, we'll just bring up my computer screen, and there he is at work. Mike Martinek at a United Fly Tires meeting, creating some of these beautiful pieces of art.